Chapters 51 and 52 of The Way of All Flesh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. The Way of All Flesh by Samuel Butler. Chapter 51. Ernest had been ordained to a curacy in one of the central parts of London. He hardly knew anything of London yet, but his instincts drew him thither. The day after he was ordained he entered upon his duties, feeling much as his father had done when he found himself boxed up in the carriage with Christina on the morning of his marriage. Before the first 3 days were over, he became aware that the light of the happiness which he had known during his 4 years at Cambridge had been extinguished, and he was appalled by the irrevocable nature of the step which he now felt he had taken much too hurriedly. The most charitable excuse that I could make for the vagaries which it will now be my duty to chronicle is that the shock of change consequent upon his becoming suddenly religious, being ordained, and leaving Cambridge, had been too much for my hero, and had for the time thrown him off an equilibrium which was yet little supported by experience, and therefore, as a matter of course, unstable. Everyone has a mass of bad work in him, which he will have to work off and get rid of before he can do better. And indeed, the more lasting a man's ultimate good work is, the more sure he is to pass through a time, and perhaps a very long one, in which there seems very little hope for him at all. We must all sow our spiritual wild oats. The fault I feel personally disposed to find with my godson is not that he had wild oats to sow, but that they were such an exceedingly tame and uninteresting crop. The sense of humour and tendency to think for himself, of which till a few months previously he had been showing fair promise, were nipped as though by a late frost, while his earlier habit of taking on trust everything that was told him by those in authority, and following everything out to the bitter end, no matter how preposterous, returned with redoubled strength. I suppose this was what might have been expected from anyone placed as Ernest was now, especially when his antecedents are remembered, but it surprised and disappointed some of his cooler-headed Cambridge friends who had begun to think well of his ability. To himself it seemed that religion was incompatible with half measures, or even with compromise. Circumstances had led to his being ordained. For the moment he was sorry they had, but he had done it and must go through with it. He therefore set himself to find out what was expected of him, and to act accordingly. His rector was a moderate high churchman, of no very pronounced views, an elderly man who had had too many curates not to have long since found out that the connection between rector and curate, like that between employer and employed in every other walk of life, was a mere matter of business. He had now 2 curates, of whom Ernest was the junior. The senior curate was named Prior, and when this gentleman made advances, as he presently did, Ernest in his forlorn state was delighted to meet them. Prior was about 28 years old. He had been at Eton and at Oxford. He was tall and passed generally for good-looking. I only saw him once for about 5 minutes, and then thought him odious both in manners and appearance. Perhaps it was because he caught me up in a way I did not like. I had quoted Shakespeare for lack of something better to fill up a sentence, and had said that one touch of nature made the whole world kin. "Ah," said Prior, in a bold, brazen way which displeased me, "but one touch of the unnatural makes it more kindred still." And he gave me a look as though he thought me an old bore, and did not care 2 straws whether I was shocked or not. naturally enough, after this I did not like him. This, however, is anticipating, for it was not till Ernest had been there 3 or 4 months in London that I happened to meet his fellow curate, and I must deal here rather with the effect he produced upon my godson than upon myself. Besides being what was generally considered good-looking, he was faultless in his get-up, and altogether the kind of man whom Ernest was sure to be afraid of and yet be taken in by. The style of his dress was very high church, and his acquaintances were exclusively of the extreme high church party, but he kept his views a good deal in the background in his rector's presence, and that gentleman, though he looked askance on some of Prior's friends, had no such ground of complaint against him as to make him sever the connection. Prior, too, was popular in the pulpit, and take him all around, it was probable that many worse curates would be found for one better. When Prior called on my hero, as soon as the two were alone together, he eyed him all over with a quick penetrating glance, and seemed not dissatisfied with the result. For I must say here that Ernest had improved in personal appearance under the more genial treatment he had received at Cambridge. Prior, in fact, approved of him sufficiently to treat him civilly, and Ernest was immediately won by anyone who did this. It was not long before he discovered that the high church party, and even Rome itself, had more to say for themselves than he had thought. This was his first snipe-like change of flight. Prior introduced him to several of his friends. They were all of them young clergymen, belonging, as I have said, to the highest of the high church school, but Ernest was surprised to find how much they resembled other people when among themselves. This was a shock to him. It was ere long a still greater one to find that certain thoughts which he had warred against as fatal to his soul, and which he had imagined he should lose once for all on ordination, were still as troublesome to him as they had been. He also saw plainly enough that the young gentlemen who formed the circle of Prior's friends were in much the same unhappy predicament as himself. This was deplorable. The only way out of it that Ernest could see was that he should get married at once. But then he did not know any one whom he wanted to marry. He did not know any woman, in fact, whom he would not rather die than marry. It had been one of Theobald's and Christina's main objects to keep him out of the way of women, and they had so far succeeded that women had become to him mysterious, inscrutable objects to be tolerated when it was impossible to avoid them, but never to be sought out or encouraged. As for any man loving, or even being at all fond of any woman, he supposed it was so, but he believed the greater number of those who professed such sentiments were liars. Now, however, it was clear that he had hoped against hope too long, and that the only thing to do was to go and ask the first woman who would listen to him to come and be married to him as soon as possible. He broached this to Prior, and was surprised to find that this gentleman, though attentive to such members of his flock as were young and good-looking, was strongly in favour of the celibacy of the clergy, as indeed were the other demure young clerics to whom Prior had introduced Ernest. Chapter 52. "You know, my dear Pontifex," said Prior to him some few weeks after Ernest had become acquainted with him, when the two were taking a constitutional one day in Kensington Gardens, "you know, my dear Pontifex, it is all very well to quarrel with Rome, but Rome has reduced the treatment of the human soul to a science, while our own Church, though so much purer in many respects, has no organized system either of diagnosis or pathology. I mean, of course, spiritual diagnosis.